A millionaire gave a sick woman a ride to the hospital. The next morning in the hospital bed, she called him and said something that made him fall to his knees. David sat alone in his high-rise apartment, surrounded by the sort of quiet that only immense wealth could buy. The walls were adorned with expensive artwork, each piece meticulously chosen and arranged by a world-renowned decorator. Polished floors gleaming with marble and elegance stretched through rooms filled with designer furniture, all untouched, like a museum frozen in time. Despite the grandeur, silence permeated every corner, seeping into David's thoughts and adding weight to the stillness. Outside, the city skyline glimmered with lights, buzzing with life, but up here, David's world felt distant, detached. His days often blended into each other. Mornings with a private chef's breakfast, afternoons reviewing stock portfolios, and evenings filled with expensive wines he barely tasted. The luxury was hollow, like a frame with no picture to hold, just a beautiful border surrounding nothingness. He had everything he wanted in his youth: a string of successful business ventures, a substantial fortune, and all the trappings of success. But with each achievement, his excitement waned, and now all he felt was an overwhelming emptiness. Years ago there had been family. His parents, who passed unexpectedly, and a younger sister he'd once shared everything with but who had drifted away, both physically and emotionally, after their loss. Relationships had come and gone, yet none lasted long enough to etch a lasting mark on his life. The people who had cared, who could have understood his deepest thoughts, were either gone or now felt like strangers. The solitude had settled around him like a familiar friend, even as it gnawed away at him in ways he didn't fully comprehend. With a soft sigh, David wandered through his spacious living room, absently straightening a painting. His gaze shifted to the rain-streaked windows, where the city lights blurred against the darkened sky. He barely noticed the sound of the rain anymore, but tonight the patter seemed louder somehow, as if each drop was knocking, trying to rouse him from the numbness that had overtaken his life. David stopped at the window, looking out with eyes that were tired, old beyond his years. The weight of memories, of people loved and lost, pressed down on him. Though the world saw a successful millionaire, here, alone in his sprawling home, David felt like just another soul adrift, lost in the sea of his own loneliness. In the darkness of his penthouse, David leaned against the cold glass, watching the rain as it painted rivulets down the windows. The city lights glittered in the distance, 1,000 stories unfolding below him, but here, in the quiet void of his home, he was only an observer. Wealth had once filled him with a sense of control and invincibility, as if he could buy freedom from life's pains and sorrows. But now, each passing year seemed to bring only emptiness, an insatiable emptiness money could never fill. David could still remember the last time he felt truly alive, and it wasn't tied to wealth or success. It had been with his family long ago, in a simpler home, where laughter had filled the rooms and love felt close enough to touch. His father had taught him about integrity, and his mother had been the gentle soul who kept their small family whole. They hadn't had much, but David never noticed. He had known warmth, and that had been enough. Yet that warmth was now a mere whisper of a memory, smothered by years of chasing profits and climbing corporate ladders. Even love, he'd found, had become transactional over the years. He tried to make connections, but people seemed more interested in his status and his net worth than his thoughts or feelings. Every date, every fling, every fleeting romance had only highlighted his isolation. He would open the door, usher them into his life, but in the end they'd leave, disenchanted by his inability to offer anything beyond material comfort. And now, here he was, alone with the echo of his own footsteps. David's hand drifted toward his phone, where an endless stream of notifications, business updates, financial reports, even invites to exclusive events, lay waiting, but they all felt inconsequential. What had it all been for? A house he couldn't turn into a home, a fortune that brought no joy, and a reputation that only masked the loneliness he carried. As the rain outside continued to fall, David let his head rest against the glass. Somewhere in the depths of his mind, he wondered if there was still something more for him, something real, something beyond the walls he'd built around himself. Or had he pushed away every chance of true connection, lost in the endless pursuit of things that never truly mattered? The rain fell harder as David finally pulled himself from the quiet of his penthouse, deciding to go for a drive through the city streets. The decision was spontaneous, something he rarely allowed himself, but the idea of being anywhere other than home, surrounded by the reminders of his isolation, felt liberating. He climbed into his sleek black car, the interior a cocoon of soft leather and quiet humming engines. As he navigated through the wet, shimmering streets, his mind drifted. The world outside was veiled in shadows, each raindrop glinting under streetlights, creating a hypnotic rhythm that matched the silent contemplation in his heart. With each mile, he felt his guarded emotions begin to loosen, as if the rain were washing away some of the carefully constructed barriers he'd built over the years. He thought of his parents, their smiles, and the way his mother had always seemed to understand him in ways words could never capture. A sudden longing to be known, truly known, arose within him like a slow ache. Just as he turned a corner, the headlights cut through the rain to reveal a figure by the roadside. A woman stood there, hunched against the downpour, her figure trembling as she held her arms close to her body. She appeared fragile, almost ghostly under the dim streetlight, soaked through and shivering. Her face was turned away, yet something about her posture, a mixture of desperation and frailty, struck him hard. David's immediate instinct was to keep driving. Encounters like these were unpredictable. They took him out of the carefully constructed safety of his world. But as he slowed, his gaze lingered on her, and something in his heart, a spark of compassion or maybe curiosity, overrode his caution. He felt as though he were being drawn toward her, compelled by a force he didn't quite understand. He pulled his car to a stop a few feet from where she stood, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. For a moment, he just watched her through the windshield, the rain distorting his view, making her look as if she were fading in and out of focus. He couldn't explain it, but he sensed that this encounter, this decision, would change something within him. With a deep breath, he reached over and opened the passenger door, inviting the woman into his world. David leaned over, peering out into the rain as the woman approached the car, each step hesitant and slow. She looked up, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation, and for a split second, he could see the vulnerability etched in her face. She was young, perhaps in her late 20s, though the weariness in her eyes made her look much older. Her hair clung to her face, plastered down by the rain, and her clothes were soaked through, leaving her shivering. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softened by an unfamiliar concern. The woman hesitated, clearly caught off guard by his question. She nodded faintly, though her shoulders remained tense, and her hand trembled as she clutched a small, tattered bag against her chest. David noticed the faint pallor of her skin and the way her breaths came in shallow, quick gasps. This was not simply a woman caught in the rain. She looked genuinely unwell, as if she'd been pushing herself to the limit. After a brief silence, she finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I was on my way to the hospital, but I couldn't make it." David's brow furrowed. This was no ordinary situation. Against every instinct that told him to maintain his distance, he felt a pull, a need to help. He gestured to the passenger seat. "Get in. I'll take you there." The woman's relief was palpable as she climbed in, settling awkwardly on the seat. She looked around the pristine interior with an expression that seemed both appreciative and wary, as if she felt out of place in such a luxurious setting. David could feel her unease, and without thinking, he reached back, grabbing a clean towel he kept in the car for emergencies. "Here," he offered, handing it to her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice tinged with both exhaustion and gratitude. She wrapped the towel around herself, and as David started the engine, he cast her a quick glance, struck by the unusual gentleness he felt. He wasn't accustomed to helping strangers, yet here he was, feeling an unfamiliar warmth as he drove her toward the hospital, their paths unknowingly weaving together in ways he couldn't yet foresee. As the car moved through the rain-slicked streets, a silence settled between them, broken only by the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers. David could feel the woman who'd quietly introduced herself as Amelia, sinking into the seat beside him, her breathing shallow. She held the towel close, her fingers clutching the fabric as if it provided some sense of security in the unfamiliar space. After a few moments she spoke, her voice a quiet murmur barely audible over the rain. "Thank you. I didn't know if anyone would stop." Her words were laced with a hint of surprise, as if kindness was something she rarely encountered. David's throat tightened slightly, caught off guard by the vulnerability in her tone. "It's no problem," he replied, glancing over at her. He wanted to ask more, but he wasn't sure where to start. Questions seemed invasive, yet the silence between them felt weighted, thick with something unsaid. Perhaps sensing his curiosity, Amelia spoke again, her gaze fixed on the rain outside. "I don't usually need help," she admitted. "But these past few months have been," she trailed off, as if the weight of her situation was too heavy to voice aloud. "Things have been difficult." David nodded, sensing that difficult was an understatement. He noticed the way her hands trembled slightly and the faint, pale sheen of her skin. She looked fragile, as though a single gust of wind might topple her over. He realized that she was holding herself together with a strength that belied her physical state, but barely. She continued, her voice softer now, as if sharing a secret. "I used to live nearby, had a job, friends, a life." Her words faded, but her eyes held a longing that told him she'd lost more than she was willing to admit. "But health has a funny way of taking things away from you bit by bit. First the job, then the friends, then everything." Her words struck a chord in David, a strange resonance that he hadn't expected. He knew what it was to lose. He'd lost family, friends, connections, but this was different. Amelia's loss seemed to hang heavy in the air, making David's fingers grip the steering wheel just a little tighter. As they approached the hospital, he felt a quiet resolve form within him, as if helping her was something he needed to do, not just for her, but for himself as well. They pulled up to the hospital entrance, the harsh fluorescent lights casting a pale glow over the wet pavement. David brought the car to a stop, glancing over at Amelia, who seemed to shrink slightly as the reality of her destination came into focus. She took a shaky breath, her gaze lingering on the hospital doors with an expression caught somewhere between relief and dread. "Thank you," she murmured, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if she feared that the words might not be enough to express what she felt. David offered a small nod, unsure of what to say. He felt something stirring in him, a strange attachment to this fragile woman he'd only just met. She represented something he hadn't encountered in a long time, an unfiltered honesty, a rawness that chipped away at his emotional walls. Amelia was someone stripped down by life's hardships, yet there was a strength in her vulnerability, a resilience that made his own struggles feel shallow in comparison. She moved to open the car door but paused, turning back toward him. For a brief moment, her eyes met his, and in them, he saw a flash of gratitude mixed with a hint of loneliness that mirrored his own. "I don't know why you stopped for me, but thank you." "Really," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. As she stepped out of the car, David felt an unexpected pang of regret. It was absurd. She was just a stranger, someone he'd helped out of impulse, yet something about her made him feel connected. He watched as she made her way inside, her figure hunched and small beneath the hospital's towering facade. When the doors closed behind her, he was left with an unsettling emptiness, as if he'd just let something vital slip through his fingers. He sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the hospital doors as if they might open again and she'd return. But minutes passed, and she didn't. David finally pulled away, heading home, yet he couldn't shake the image of her from his mind. That night, he lay awake, Amelia's words, her haunted gaze, the fragility of her presence all echoing in his thoughts. She'd made an imprint on him, one that he couldn't quite explain, and in the stillness of his room, he wondered why he couldn't simply let her go. David was roused from his sleep by the persistent buzzing of his phone. He blinked, disoriented, glancing at the clock on his bedside table. It was just past dawn, and a thin light seeped through his bedroom curtains. Frowning, he reached for his phone, feeling an unusual tension in his chest as he answered. "Hello. Is this Mr. David Carlyle?" The voice on the other end was calm, yet there was a formality to it that made David sit up straighter, instinctively bracing himself. "Yes, speaking," he replied cautiously. "This is Nurse Henderson from St. Mary's Hospital," she continued. "We have a patient here, Amelia Martin, who requested that we contact you." David's mind snapped into focus, and the image of Amelia, trembling and drenched, clutching the towel he'd given her, flashed vividly before him. He hadn't been able to shake the memory of her fragile form, and now, hearing her name in connection with the hospital, he felt an inexplicable rush of concern. Is she all right?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Part of him couldn't understand why he cared so much, but he couldn't deny the strange protectiveness he felt. The nurse's tone softened, as though she recognized the worry in his voice. "She's stable for now, but she insisted on speaking with you." She seemed quite determined. David was silent for a moment, caught off guard. He hadn't expected to hear from her again, let alone so soon, and the urgency in her request stirred something deep within him. She was just a stranger, wasn't she? Yet the thought of Amelia, alone in a hospital room, vulnerable and reaching out to him, made the ache in his chest deepen. "Yes, I'll come by," he replied, barely giving himself time to think. The nurse confirmed the details and hung up, leaving David alone in the quiet of his room, his phone still clutched in his hand. He sat there for a few seconds, feeling a mixture of apprehension and anticipation. He knew, somehow, that this meeting would lead him somewhere he hadn't intended to go. Yet he couldn't resist. Something in him needed to see her, to understand why she'd called. With a resolute breath, he got up, already preparing to leave. David found himself pacing his bedroom, running a hand through his hair as he wrestled with his emotions. It was irrational to be so invested in a stranger's life, he reminded himself. Yet, every time he considered dismissing her call, an intense feeling of dread crept in, leaving him unsettled and hollow. He knew he couldn't turn his back on her. The compassion he'd tried so hard to ignore over the years had resurfaced, urging him to respond to Amelia's plea. After a few more moments of silent indecision, David threw on a jacket, grabbed his keys and left the penthouse, his heart pounding in his chest. The streets were still quiet, early morning light casting a soft glow over the city as he drove toward the hospital. His mind raced, thinking back to their brief interaction and the look in her eyes when she thanked him, eyes that held stories of hardship and loss, of resilience in the face of life's relentless struggles. Something about Amelia had stayed with him, lingering like a half-remembered dream he couldn't quite shake. As he neared the hospital, his thoughts turned toward what she might want to say. Had she asked for him out of desperation, or had something about their encounter touched her as much as it had him? The possibilities played out in his mind, each more confusing than the last. He felt a flicker of fear of uncovering something he wasn't ready to confront, something that might make him question everything he'd come to accept about his solitary existence. The hospital loomed ahead, its stark white facade lit up in the soft morning haze. David parked and stepped out of his car, the brisk morning air sharpening his senses. As he approached the entrance, the weight of the unknown settled over him, a sensation both heavy and electric. He had no idea what lay beyond those doors, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. With each step toward Amelia's room, his pulse quickened, and he felt a vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself in years. It was as though some unseen force had drawn him here, binding his fate to hers in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. And despite his every instinct to protect himself, he knew he would face whatever awaited him on the other side of that hospital door. David moved through the sterile hallways, his footsteps echoing against the tiled floor as he approached Amelia's room. The hospital was quiet in the early morning, only a few nurses and patients moving about, their expressions soft with the kind of weariness that comes with waiting and worry. A strange mix of anticipation and trepidation grew within him, each step feeling heavier than the last. He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and gently pushed open the door to her room. Amelia lay in the hospital bed, her form small and fragile beneath the thin white sheets. Her eyes were closed, her breathing slow and shallow. For a moment, David wondered if she was asleep, but then she stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. When she saw him, a faint smile touched her lips, an expression that seemed to hold both gratitude and relief. He took a step closer, feeling a sense of protectiveness he couldn't quite explain. "You came," she murmured, her voice soft but filled with emotion. There was a glint of something in her eyes. Determination, perhaps, or a quiet strength that made her seem even more vulnerable yet resilient. David managed a small nod, his throat tight. "Of course," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. He pulled a chair up beside her bed, lowering himself into it, feeling strangely out of place but unwilling to leave. Amelia's gaze softened, as if she sensed his unease. "I know it might seem strange," she began, her tone gentle, "that I asked for you. But after last night, after you stopped, I just felt I needed to see you again." David's heart clenched at her words, but he remained silent, allowing her to gather her thoughts. She took a shallow breath, visibly gathering her strength to speak. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She looked away for a moment, her gaze fixed on a point in the distance, as though steeling herself to share something deeply personal. David waited, feeling an inexplicable sense of urgency in the air, a tension that hinted at something life-altering. He could tell by the look in her eyes that what she was about to say held weight, perhaps more than he was prepared for. And yet, sitting there beside her, he realized he was ready to listen, ready to open himself to whatever truth she had come to share. Amelia's hands trembled slightly as she pulled the sheets closer to her. Her gaze focused on a point just beyond him, as if she were reliving a distant memory. David leaned forward, his chest tight with anticipation, feeling that whatever she was about to say would alter something fundamental within him. "David," she began softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know if you remember, but my mother told me once that she met a man like you years ago." She paused, her fingers twisting the edge of the blanket nervously. "She told me about him, about how they'd shared something, brief but beautiful." David's brow furrowed as he listened, piecing together fragments of memories, old recollections of a past he'd long buried. He felt a pang of recognition at her words, though he couldn't quite place the familiarity. His gaze met hers, and he saw in her eyes a depth of vulnerability that made him hold his breath. "My mother always said she didn't know if she'd ever see him again," Amelia continued, her voice cracking slightly. "She kept so much from me, but one thing she said over and over was that she never forgot him, and that I might be his." The impact of her words struck David like a tidal wave, leaving him speechless, unable to process the enormity of what she was suggesting. Memories from years ago flooded back, visions of a summer when he'd been younger, freer, living in the moment, reckless with a passion he hadn't felt since. There had been a woman, a fleeting romance that had ended almost as quickly as it had begun. And now, as he stared at Amelia, he felt the undeniable possibility that she could be the child he never knew existed. Amelia watched him, her eyes filled with equal parts hope and trepidation. "I know this is sudden," she whispered, "but when I saw you last night, something told me. I don't know why, but I felt like I recognized you. And now here we are." David felt his heart pounding as he struggled to find words, the weight of missed years and lost chances pressing down on him. He could only look at her, overwhelmed by the realization that he may be staring into the eyes of his own daughter, a connection he had unknowingly longed for all his life. As Amelia's words settled over him, David felt himself pulled back into a memory long buried, a time when life had felt full of color and possibility. He was young, filled with ambition but not yet hardened by the world. That summer, he'd been on a trip to a small coastal town, a brief escape from the pressures of his budding career. It was there he'd met her mother, a woman with laughter that sounded like music and eyes that held a kindness he hadn't seen before or since. They'd spent warm, sunlit days walking by the shore, talking about dreams, fears, and everything in between. It was a short-lived romance, a love forged in the intensity of the moment. She'd been open-hearted, unafraid of vulnerability, and had drawn him out in ways he hadn't allowed himself to experience since. But David, young and focused on his career, hadn't let himself linger. He'd left, promising to write, to call, though life and ambition had quickly overshadowed those promises. Now, as he sat in the hospital room beside Amelia, fragments of that summer flooded his mind, piecing together the parts of a story he'd nearly forgotten. He hadn't known she was pregnant when he left. There had been no calls, no letters from her after he returned to the city, and he'd assumed she had simply moved on as he had. But now he realized the enormity of what he'd missed, the chance to know a child, to be part of a family he'd unknowingly left behind. The thought brought an ache to his chest, a mixture of regret and yearning that felt as raw as a fresh wound. He looked at Amelia, truly seeing her now, searching her face for traces of the woman he'd once known, and finding them, the same eyes, the same quiet resilience. His heart pounded with the realization, each beat a reminder of time lost and moments that could never be reclaimed. Amelia watched him, her expression a mixture of hope and fear, as if she were watching him relive a memory she herself had never known. And in that moment, David understood with profound clarity. He had a daughter, a link to the past and a chance, however faint, to make amends for the years he'd missed. David sat motionless, his gaze fixed on Amelia as the gravity of the revelation settled within him. He felt a surge of emotions, shock, disbelief, and a profound sadness for the years he'd unknowingly lost. The world around him seemed to fade away, leaving only the fragile connection between them, pulsing with a life of its own. He wanted to speak, to say something that could convey the torrent of emotions surging through him, but words seemed inadequate. Amelia's face softened, a flicker of compassion shining in her eyes. She seemed to sense the turmoil within him, her own gaze laced with an understanding that surprised him. He felt a pang of guilt, realizing that for her, this moment was not just a reunion, but a step toward closure, a chance to connect with a father she had always wondered about yet never known. Taking a deep breath, David reached for her hand, his fingers trembling as they wrapped around hers. "Amelia," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never knew." If I had, he stopped, unable to finish the thought. There was so much he wanted to say, apologies and regrets mingling in his heart, but nothing felt sufficient. She squeezed his hand gently, offering him a faint, reassuring smile. "I know," she replied softly. "Mom didn't talk about it much, and I never wanted to press her. But after she passed, I had this need to find you, even if it was just to understand where I came from. Last night when you stopped, I felt like it was meant to happen." David's heart twisted at her words. She had been alone, bearing the weight of a mother's memory and a father's absence, all while battling her own hardships. In that moment, he saw not just his daughter, but a reflection of himself, a solitary soul who had endured pain, yet somehow emerged resilient. He felt an overwhelming urge to make amends, to offer her the presence he'd denied her all her life. "I'm here now," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "For as long as you need me, I'm here." A tear slipped down Amelia's cheek, and for the first time, David felt a sense of purpose and connection that he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just a chance to reclaim his past. It was a chance to forge a future, to redefine what family could mean, starting here in this room with his daughter. David's resolve began to crumble as he held Amelia's hand, the enormity of everything he had missed pressing down on him like a tidal wave. His carefully guarded composure shattered, and he fell to his knees beside her bed, unable to hold back the grief that had silently built up over the years. Tears pooled in his eyes, and his breaths came in shallow, shaky gasps. He tried to speak, to offer some words of solace, but his voice caught in his throat. Amelia looked at him, her own expression softened by understanding. Gently, she squeezed his hand, grounding him in the moment. Her touch, so light yet filled with forgiveness, reached parts of his heart that he had long forgotten how to feel. The guilt gnawed at him. He hadn't been there for her, hadn't known to be, and now he had to face that truth in its raw, unfiltered state. "I'm sorry," he choked out, his voice a whisper. "I'm so sorry for everything I wasn't there for. For every moment I missed. I didn't know." He searched her face, looking for any sign of resentment, but all he saw was a quiet acceptance, a calm understanding that only deepened his remorse. She had endured so much, and despite it all, she was willing to let him in, to give him a chance to be the father he'd never been. That realization struck him with an intensity he hadn't anticipated, making him feel both profoundly grateful and profoundly unworthy. "David," Amelia's voice was gentle, the softness of it drawing him out of his anguish. "I know you didn't know, and I know life has a way of pulling people in different directions. But you're here now, and that means everything." Her words cut through his sorrow, filling him with a fragile hope. He clung to them, finding solace in the knowledge that, despite his failings, she was giving him a chance to make things right. A chance to be part of her life, no matter how late, and to forge something real from the broken pieces of their past. As he knelt there, David made a silent promise, one born not out of obligation but out of a deep, newfound love. He would be there for her. He would make up for the years lost, and he would give her the father she deserved. David stayed kneeling beside Amelia, his mind grappling with the painful reality of all he'd missed. The birthdays, the milestones, the simple moments that made up a life. Each one felt like a wound, a reminder of the time he could never get back. He wanted to know everything about her, yet he felt as though he had no right to ask. How did one begin to catch up on a lifetime? Amelia watched him, her gaze filled with both compassion and understanding. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to carry all that weight," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "We've both lived lives shaped by choices and circumstances, but that doesn't mean we can't start here, with what we have now." Her words struck him deeply, both soothing and sobering. He had been so focused on the loss, on the years spent in solitude and ignorance, that he hadn't allowed himself to consider the possibility of starting anew. He looked at her, truly looked, seeing not just his daughter, but a woman who had faced her own battles with courage and grace. She wasn't defined by his absence. She had become her own person despite it. "I missed so much," he whispered, his voice laden with regret. "Every day, every year. I missed everything that made you who you are." He paused, the weight of the confession sinking in. "I don't know how to make it right. I don't know if I ever can." Amelia's expression softened. "You're here now, and that's more than enough for me." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "All my life I wondered about you, about who you were. But now, I see that the man who stopped on the side of the road to help me, he's the one I needed to meet. Not some perfect father. Just you." David's heart clenched at her words, her forgiveness a balm to wounds he hadn't even realized he carried. She was offering him a chance to begin again, to build something honest and true from this moment forward. He knew he couldn't change the past, but her words gave him hope that they could create something meaningful from here on out. David sat back, his hand still entwined with Amelia's, feeling a newfound resolve blossom within him. He understood now that this was his chance, perhaps his only chance, to truly make a difference in her life. He looked at her, his gaze steady, a quiet determination in his eyes. "I don't want to lose any more time," he said firmly, his voice stronger now. "If you'll let me, I want to be here for you however I can. I know I can't make up for what's been lost, but I promise you, Amelia, I won't waste any more time." Amelia's eyes softened, and he saw a flicker of something close to relief in her expression. She had been carrying her own burdens, her own unspoken questions, wondering if she would ever have a family, a father she could rely on. David's words seemed to give her something she hadn't dared to hope for, a future where she wasn't alone, where she could lean on someone who genuinely cared. "I would like that," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. A small, genuine smile crept across her lips, and for the first time, David felt the warmth of acceptance, a feeling of belonging that he hadn't experienced in years. He felt a wave of gratitude wash over him, grateful for this chance to finally be part of something meaningful. As he sat beside her, he silently vowed to himself that he would be the father she had deserved all along. He would be there through the good days and the bad, offering his presence and his unwavering support. The walls he had built over the years, the emotional armor he wore to guard himself from pain, now felt unnecessary. In Amelia's eyes, he saw an opportunity to be more than the lonely man in the penthouse, disconnected from the world. He could be part of something bigger, something that made every choice, every struggle worth it. David squeezed her hand gently, a smile forming on his face. From here on out, Amelia, you're not alone. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing with certainty. He was finally ready to live it, with her by his side. The days that followed marked the beginning of a quiet but profound transformation in David's life. He spent hours at the hospital by Amelia's side, bringing her meals, reading to her, or simply sitting with her in comfortable silence. Gone were the sterile, impersonal interactions that had once characterized his world. With Amelia, he found himself present in each moment, attentive to her needs and genuinely invested in her recovery. Each morning he arrived early, eager to see her, to ask how she felt and what he could do to make her day easier. Amelia, though still frail, had a strength about her, and she met each of his gestures with a warmth that only deepened his sense of purpose. David found himself navigating emotions he had long suppressed: tenderness, protectiveness, and an overwhelming desire to be there for her in any way she needed. At first, the nurses and doctors looked at him with surprise, unused to seeing such a dedicated presence in the waiting room. Here was a man they knew only by reputation, the wealthy businessman with little attachment to anyone. But as the days wore on, they began to see a different side of him. He became known as Amelia's father, the man who never left her side, who seemed willing to do anything for her well-being. One morning, he arrived with a bouquet of her favorite flowers, a discovery he'd made after a few subtle questions during one of their talks. Amelia's eyes lit up when she saw them, her smile transforming her tired face with a spark of happiness. For David, that smile was worth more than any amount of wealth he'd ever accumulated. "This is just the beginning," he whispered to her, placing the flowers on the side table. "I've missed too much already, and I won't let another moment slip by." Amelia's gaze softened, her eyes shining with gratitude. She reached for his hand, her grip weak but full of trust. "Thank you, David," she murmured. "Thank you for choosing to stay." In that quiet hospital room, surrounded by the gentle hum of machines and the scent of fresh flowers, David realized he was no longer just a man alone in the world. He was a father, present and accounted for, ready to face whatever the future held with Amelia by his side. As Amelia's strength began to return, David found himself discovering the simple joys of getting to know her, piece by piece. Their conversations grew longer and more personal, touching on everything from childhood memories to dreams and ambitions. They shared moments of laughter, sometimes over the smallest things, a funny story from her school days, or David's attempts at remembering family recipes that hadn't seen the light of day in decades. For David, these exchanges felt like gifts, each one building the bridge they had both unknowingly longed for. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed into her hospital room, Amelia shared a story about her passion for painting, how she'd spent hours as a child drawing and filling notebooks with colorful worlds of her own creation. David listened, spellbound, watching her face light up with a joy he hadn't seen before. She spoke of how art had been her escape during the difficult times, a way to cope with her mother's passing and the challenges that followed. "I'd love to see your work someday," he said softly, a genuine interest shining in his eyes. Amelia smiled, her cheeks tinged with a hint of color. "Like that. I haven't painted in a while, but maybe now I'll start again." Their bond deepened with each shared story, each exchange a small step toward a relationship neither of them had expected. They started learning each other's quirks and habits, how Amelia liked her tea with a dash of honey, or how David had a fondness for classical music, a small remnant from his mother's influence. Slowly, Amelia began to see him not as a stranger or even a long-lost father, but as someone who genuinely cared, someone she could rely on. For David, these moments healed parts of him he hadn't even realized were wounded. He found himself letting go of his need for control, his carefully constructed image as a man of few attachments. In its place, he embraced a role he had never envisioned but now felt ready to embody. As they laughed and shared their lives, David understood something profoundly simple yet deeply impactful. He was no longer living just for himself. Amelia was part of him now, her presence filling the void he'd carried for so long. Together, they were weaving the beginnings of a bond that felt both new and timeless. Several weeks later, on a crisp morning bathed in soft sunlight, Amelia was finally discharged from the hospital. David was there, ready and waiting to help her settle into her new reality. As they stepped outside, the fresh air felt like a promise of renewal, of new beginnings. Amelia leaned on him for support, her steps cautious but steady, and they walked slowly toward his car, the quiet between them filled with a warmth that needed no words. David drove her to his home, now filled with signs of her presence. A cozy guest room had been prepared with touches of Amelia's favorite colors, small paintings she'd mentioned she loved, and fresh flowers on the bedside table. The grand, lonely penthouse had transformed into a place that felt alive, a place where she would be comfortable and feel truly welcome. In the days that followed, they began to settle into a routine, creating a life that felt beautifully ordinary and deeply meaningful. Each morning, David would make breakfast, learning to master Amelia's preferred oatmeal and toast, while she sat nearby, sharing stories or discussing the day's plans. Afternoons were often spent in quiet companionship, David catching up on work in the study while Amelia sketched or painted, her creativity blooming once again in the safety of their newfound family. One evening, as they sat on the terrace overlooking the city skyline, Amelia turned to him, her expression serene but thoughtful. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think that family was something you were either born with or not. But maybe family is something we get to choose too. Maybe it's about who's willing to stay, who cares enough to be there." David looked at her, feeling the profound truth of her words resonate within him. "I think you're right," he replied, his voice gentle but full of conviction. "And I choose this. I choose you, Amelia, every day." Amelia smiled, and in that moment, their shared silence spoke volumes. Here together they had found something both of them had spent their lives searching for. A family, bound not by the past but by the choice to be present, to care, to stay. As they watched the sun set over the city, David felt a rare peace, one that came not from wealth or success, but from knowing he was finally truly home. The future was unknown, but for the first time he looked forward to it, confident that whatever lay ahead, he and Amelia would face it together.